How's it going? Today I'm going to be doing another book review, this time for the second book in the Dune series, Dune Messiah. I'll just be sharing a little bit of my thoughts about it, what the experience was like reading it. Um, I think Dune Messiah is generally considered to be the slowest and least interesting of the books in the Dune series. I couldn't say for myself as I haven't read the entire series yet. But what I will say is Dune Messiah was definitely slower and less interesting than the first Dune book, the first book in the series. Um, but that being said, it does not mean at all that it was a bad read or it wasn't a good book, um, because the standard of the first Dune book is already set so high. So it can be kind of difficult to meet the expectations of the first book set. Um, but one thing that I really, really respect about Dune Messiah was that it wasn't really necessarily written as something meant to live up to the hype or the high bar that the first book set. One thing that I immediately noticed off the bat when I started reading Dune Messiah was that it is it is a continuation of the very same narrative that drove the first Dune book. Um, it very much felt at the end of the first Dune book. It definitely, that's my dog, by the way, right there, by the way. Hey bud, how's it going? Um, but by the end of the first Dune book, you can definitely tell that Frank Herbert is not done with the story. He's completed that. He's finished that arc of the story. He's finished that part of it. He's finished that part of the narrative. But he has more to tell. Um, and Dune Messiah, you can tell from the very second that you start reading it that this wasn't just meant to be like a money grab. It wasn't just meant to be something um, something to appease the fans who wanted more Dune content. You can tell that this was equally as much a part of the narrative of this world that Frank Herbert loved and put so much effort into constructing, as was the first book. Um, Now again, it's not as fast paced, or it's not as good as the first one. You don't get to see as much of the cool world building. You do still get you get to see some new world building for sure, but you don't get to see nearly as much of the cool desert planet of Dune, of Arrakis in this book. But you see a lot more of kind of the fallout of what happens after the first Dune book. You see a lot of there's some new parties introduced, like the Beni Tleilax, I think is how it's said. Um, and there's a lot of new and interesting concepts introduced, and it's really interesting seeing this hero Paul, who in the previous book, um, he was written as like a hero who came from nothing to literally the emperor of the entire known universe. Um, and one thing you'll see in Dune Messiah that I really respect was that despite the fact that he is this heroic, a lot of people revere him as a god. Um, in this book, he is kind of stuck, and he doesn't have a lot of power to get himself out of the trap that he has found himself in. Um, so he's a god man who still has weaknesses, um, and it's really interesting to see how Frank Herbert was able to construct, how he was able to build a weakness for the most powerful man in the universe. Um, and I think he does it in an absolutely ingenious and completely believable way. Um, and it's really interesting just seeing this powerful individual who has very little power to escape the grasps of his enemies. Um, Despite the fact that he has more power than anyone else in the universe, there are still people that are able to wrap their fingers around him and manipulate him in ways that they can effectively control him. And at the end of the book, you'll see something very, very interesting. Um, Spoiler warning right now. Um, Paul is walked into a corner in this book, right? Um, what they do is they take Duncan Idaho from the first book and the Benny Tlilax. They turn him into a Gola, which is essentially a resurrected person that doesn't have any of their memories. So this Gola looks exactly like Duncan Idaho. He has like the same skill sets and everything like that. It's literally in Duncan Idaho's body, but he doesn't have any of Duncan Idaho's memories. And they call him a hate throughout the first part of the book. Um, and they give him Paul's enemies give hate to Paul as a gift, basically saying, "Hey, look, here's your old friend Duncan Idaho who died in the last book. He doesn't have any of his memories, but he's got everything else." And by the end of the book, Hate actually ends up uncovering his memories as Duncan Idaho, and instead he becomes instead Duncan Idaho instead of just this husk of what he once was. Um, but that wasn't even a whole part of that. That was only a part of that was only a part of the trap, a part of a piece of the puzzle that Paul's enemies had laid for him. Um, and the reason for the whole hate Duncan Idaho thing was to see if it was possible for Angola to retain his memories, and through Paul, they learned that he was able to do that. It was an experiment of sorts. And once they find out that that is possible, again, more spoiler warnings, um, they they kill Chani, essentially. Chani, Paul's wife, dies in childbirth. Um, and then their plan is to take Chani's dead body, turn her into a Gola, and then essentially blackmailing Paul into capitulating to their will. Um, with the Chani Gola, and they could give her memories back, and he could have Chani back. Um, and I think, and obviously this is a very precarious situation for Paul. He doesn't have a lot to do in this situation, and I think what Frank Herbert decides to do with the story here is absolutely incredible. And I think it is a striking display of Paul's strong will and heroic character. Um, and I think it shows how well Frank Herbert knew his own characters. So what Paul does is, after his two children are born, and after Chani is dead, rather than capitulating to his enemies and accepting the Chani Gola, he walks off into the desert and dies, essentially. I don't know if he actually does die or if he comes back later in the series, but as far as the narrative is concerned, where I am, he dies. Um, and he leaves the empire he leaves the rule of the empire to his younger sister. Um, and then she rules in Paul's stead with their two kids and with Duncan Idaho. And I think that's an absolutely genius way to for Paul to essentially win against his enemies, is by not allowing them to have the power, not allowing them to manipulate his emotions like that, and freeing himself from the emotions instead and killing himself essentially. And that I just thought that it was an absolutely, first off, it was just a sick ending. Just the thought of Paul Muad'Dib, the emperor of the universe, the the god of the Fremen people, the king of Dune. He walks off into the desert, never to be seen again. And I think it's completely poetic. I think it was an amazingly spun narrative, and I don't know, it was a really good book. Definitely worth a read. Um, I think if I think if the original Dune book was a 10 out of 10, I'd probably give this a solid 7.8 to 8 out of 10. It's a really good book. Again, it's kind of just the bridge in the story between the first book and the rest of the series, and it definitely feels a little bit like that sometimes. But it's equally as necessary as the rest of the books in the series are. But yeah, those are my thoughts on the Dune Messiah book.